How are you then?
I'm fine. I'm fine.
So Emlyn is the chair of the Centre for Pagan Studies in the Dori Valiente Foundation, and he's just joined us. Do you like to do an introduction, Emlyn, or are you ready to start the Zoom?
Well, how many people have we got here at the moment? We've only got, what, 5? 6,
No, we've got 16 so far.
Oh, have we? Oh, yes, I haven't seen the little pointing along arrow. My apologies, folks.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we had 20 odd who've registered, but we can't keep people waiting, can we, for a long time?
No, that's fine.
Yes. So, okay.
Okay, then. Without any further ado, welcome to everybody.
Yes.
And as you've probably seen, tonight's speaker is Jennifer Uzzell, who's a PhD student at Durham University, and she's working under the auspices of the Centre for Death and Life Studies, based in the Department of Theology and Religion. She's conducting research into death rites amongst contemporary Druids in the UK, including funeral ritual and natural burial. In addition to her PhD research, which she's doing on a part-time basis, she's also the co-owner and director of a progressive funeral home that forms part of a growing movement in the UK towards greater openness, honesty, and authenticity in the way funerals are arranged and conducted. In this capacity, she's helped to reimagine and redesign funeral rituals that are relevant to those involved, and has provided help and advice with home funerals. She is also a religious education consultant who's worked in a number of capacities for the Religious Education Council of England and Wales, and is a senior examiner in religious studies. As well as Druidry, her academic interests include Hinduism, Buddhism, the philosophy of religion, and ethics. On that note, I shall hand you over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Okay, so the title is "What is Paganism?" That's quite a big topic, actually. Goes without saying that I'm only going to touch on a number of things today, and that I'm also going to give you a personal view to some extent from where I'm coming from, certainly within academic religious studies. First of all, I'd like to really thank the Centre for Pagan Studies for giving me this opportunity and this platform. I'm a little bit nervous about tonight for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I've never spoken publicly through Zoom before, so I'm kind of used to having people in a room with me. And at the moment, what I'm looking at is my script sheet, so it's a bit strange. So bear with me with that. The other thing is that I'm actually, and you'll find this funny, I'm sure, I'm not used to talking to pagans. I am used to talking to pagans. I'm not used to talking to pagans academically about paganism. So a concern that I have is a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be sort of grandmother sucking eggs, and that you will be very familiar with it. I do know for a fact that there are a number of people here that are not pagans. And so I am going to do a little bit of sort of Paganism 101, but I'm going to try and steer clear from that as much as I can, because I don't want to bore everybody, and to talk more about what I see as where paganism fits into a broader picture within religious studies, because that might be something that you're not as familiar with. The other apology about tonight is if what I say seems to be slightly skewed towards Druidry, that is for two reasons. Firstly, because it is my own personal path, I am a Druid, and secondly, because that's what I'm studying. So most of the books and the papers and things that I've read sort of skew in that direction. It's not deliberate, and it's not in any way an attempt to suggest that is the only paganism worth talking about. And I have tried to avoid doing that tonight. So again, bear with me. So what is paganism? Well, leaving aside any ancient roots, and I'm going to come back to that idea later on, leaving aside the idea of whatever roots there may be in antiquity, I think that there are two main periods of history in which modern paganism can be seen to have its roots. The first one is the 18th and 19th centuries, with possibly in part fueled by the Industrial Revolution, and certainly by Celtic revivalism in Wales and Scotland and Ireland. You have this interest in Druidry, you have this interest in ancient religion, and also with the Romantic movement, with the Romantic poets who start to talk about nature in reverential and sacred terms. And with them comes a revival of interest, particularly in Hellenism and Hellenistic deities coming out of Greece and Rome. And so you sort of have a cultural background and an artistic and literary background that leads in this sort of direction. I'm not going to say too much more about that. It's a fascinating topic in its own right. But again, it's a case of having fertile cultural soil in which ideas that were connected with a pre-Christian spirituality could start to take root. And I'm going to suggest at the end, probably of my second talk, that we're maybe moving into another one of those eras now, and that will be very interesting in a very different way. People start to have statues of Pan in their garden, people start to think in these sorts of ways, and it just opens up all sorts of new ways of thinking. The second period in which modern paganism has its roots is, of course, starting in the 1950s and moving into the 1970s, with characters such as Gerald Gardner, Doreen Valiente, Ross Nichols, and that generation of people who are picking up ideas that come out of the Romantic movement, that come out of the 19th century occultism, and also bringing in new ideas and picking up on academic currents that were current in their day. Now, some of those academic currents have since been shown to not be as good as they maybe were thought to be at the time. But these people were responding to academia as it existed in their day. And that, I think, is another thing that can be said about paganism in general, that its relationship with scholarship and with academia has always been a very strong and a very robust one. So, first of all, with my talk on what is paganism, I'd like to start with what paganism isn't. The first thing that paganism isn't is it is not a religion. At least it's not a single religion. Very much like Hinduism in this respect. Hinduism is often regarded as being a single religion. And when you look at the various different streams and the different threads in Hinduism, you can see that actually it's quite difficult to make that argument about it. Paganism, I think there's more of an acknowledgement within paganism that it's not a single religion. But sometimes when people view us from outside, when we get media interest, they want to know what pagans believe about this, that, and the other. And as we all know, that's a hide into nothing. So I see paganism as being more of an umbrella term that covers a family of religions that have certain familial connections. So to use the analogy of Hinduism again, I would say I tend to refer to the various Hinduisms along with Sikhism, Buddhism and Jainism as dharmic religions, because they have an idea running through them, and that idea is connected to the ideas of samsara, dharma, karma and moksha. And paganism is similar in that there are certain ideas that seem to run through all of the pagan traditions, even though they are quite different to each other. What they tend to have in common then is a relational worldview. And what I mean by that, and I'm going to be coming back to this time and time and time again, I've read a lot, particularly some of the early scholarship on paganism, that saw it as being almost the culmination of the move towards the cult of the individual. And a lot that was written, particularly about New Age religion as well, said that it was this pick and mix, and it was centered on the idea of the individual and the individual finding their spiritual path and taking what they need. And that is certainly not what I see in modern paganism as it exists today. What I see is very much relational and almost a movement against that cult of the individual that's come out of a postmodern society. So paganisms then, and I'm going to use, I think, the term paganisms as some scholars of religion do, is concerned with the ways that humans interact and form relationships with each other, with the natural world, with the animals and plants that inhabit it, and for some pagans, also with ancestors, local land spirits, and deities or deity in some way. Now, in my academic writing, I have quite a lot about specifically what Druidry is. The fact that I've got the best part of a chapter just on what Druidry is gives you some idea of how easy it is to find a definition. But in the course of that, I came across a quote from Pagan Dawn magazine, actually, by Professor Ronald Hutton. And he was talking about paganisms in general. And this is one of the best definitions I've come across. And I just wanted to share this with you. He talks about paganisms as a complex of religions, calling on ancient ideas and images, but addressing some of the greatest needs of modernity. And in doing so, drawing on major streams of British culture, going back over 200 years, and a continuous tradition of ceremonial magic going back millennia. Now that last line is very interesting because it's a change of opinion in Hutton from his very first writings, in that he now believes that you can trace a direct line going back to ancient Egyptian ideas through Arabia, through the ancient Greeks, through Freemasonry and occultism and into modern magic, which is fascinating. But that idea of religions that are inspired by ancient ideas, but are incredibly well fitted to a modern world, is one that I think really gets to the heart of the issue about paganism and makes it so interesting, both as a personal path and as something to study as an academic. So what do pagan religions tend to have in common? They have many, many things that differentiate them. They have many things that are commonalities and make them obviously belong in the same category together. You tend to find some sort of expressed belief. Now, worth mentioning as well before I go into this, that the list I'm about to give is A, not exclusive, and B, not all pagan traditions have all of these ideas, and not all individuals within a particular pagan tradition have all of these ideas. These are some of the commonalities that tend to crop up in pagan religions. And I'm using the word religions deliberately, and I'll come back to that later on as well. I know it's a word that doesn't sit comfortably with everybody. It's a bugbear of mine. I'll come back to that later on. So there tends to be belief in deity of some form. Now, that's where the commonality ends. And it's not universal. There are atheist pagans. But there tends to be a belief in something. Now, that ranges from what I would call monism. And monism is a belief that there is one thing and that everything ultimately is that thing. This is an idea that's expressed in Hinduism in the Advaita Vedanta, which basically says that your soul is God. Not a God, not a reflection of God, but the whole of God, because God is not multiple. And this is a belief that crops up in paganism as well. There is also, of course, polytheism. And this is something that has, as I've watched in the last 10 years or so, this has become, I think, a lot more prevalent in paganism, particularly what theologians sometimes refer to as hard polytheism. So hard polytheism is the belief that the gods exist in some form. What the gods are is open to a lot of debate, but the gods exist in some form and they are real and they exist whether you believe in them or not. And that it is possible to get into some form of relationship with the gods. the other end of that spectrum, soft polytheism, is the belief that we use gods, but what the gods actually are is either projections of aspects of our own personalities in a highly Jungian manner, or they are personifications of natural forces, but on whatever level they are symbolic rather than real. And pagans hold both of those beliefs and all shades in between. And really, in terms of what you see pagans doing and how you see them behaving, it makes very little difference which end of that scale they are on. You will also see duotheism, the belief in usually a god and a goddess, and very often a belief that all individual goddesses or gods are expressions of that god and goddess. So that while worship or prayers or magic might use individual goddesses, that ultimately that is one goddess. And this also appears in goddess spirituality, which is monotheistic. There is one goddess and she is feminine. So all of these exist within paganism, as does pantheism, the belief that the gods and indeed ourselves are expressions of the consciousness of the universe, and panentheism, which is that there is a reality outside the universe which is reflected into nature. And this is an idea that was very big in the 18th and 19th centuries and which fed into the birth of paganism, I think, in some quite significant ways. Another thing that is common in pagan traditions is this sense of a connection to an ancient past. So it's perhaps most obviously seen in Druidry, because we know that in the Iron Age there were people in Europe who were known as Druids, and that they were some sort of priestly group. To be fair, that is pretty much all we know about them. And Ronald Hutton, at the beginning of his fantastic book, highly recommended, Blood and Mistletoe, spends about 20 pages explaining that that is about all we know about them. There tend to be two schools of thought. The ancient sources divide into Greek writers, most famously Strabo, writing about 300 BC. And the Greek writers tend to present Druids as wise astronomers, lawgivers, philosophers, and magicians. And the Roman sources tend to present them as bloodthirsty savages who sacrifice people. The truth is probably somewhere in between. And both, of course, are writing for their own purposes. None of them is a pure representation of what people saw. And very few of them, except possibly Caesar, maybe, are first-hand accounts. So, and then in Wicca, of course, there is the idea that this is an ancient goddess-based religion that goes back into the pre-Christian past. That's quite a complex idea. It's quite a controversial idea. At the end of the day, I'm going to suggest that in both Druidry and Wicca, it really doesn't matter. It's not important whether that is the case or not, because these religions, these religious traditions, and heathenry as well, of course, take inspiration from the past. There is something in the idea of the past that they find to be a deep source of inspiration and an aspiration. So in the case of Druidry, that aspiration is to be wise, to be just, and to be a purveyor of wisdom and connection, I suppose, to the land. And that is a good aspiration. And it's, yes, it's rooted in what the Greeks said about the Druids, but it's a good aspiration. And I would suggest the same for Wicca, whether this is a comparatively new religion or whether it does have elements that go back behind the Christians, really is not important. And another thing that I feel quite strongly is that this idea that much much is written about the connecting period between paganism and Christianity, we've tended to draw far too hard a line there and say these people were pagans, these people were Christians. That's a pagan idea that was repressed by the Christians, but it's still there. I'm thinking about things like Beltane. I'm thinking about things like the Mary Lloyd in Wales. Actually, the world didn't change when people became Christians. People still lived in the same world. The world changed radically during the Enlightenment. The world was radically disenchanted during the Enlightenment, and people's way of looking at the world changed in a way that modern paganism, I think, is actively seeking to address. One of the key missions of modern paganism, and one of the key ways that it operates in the modern world, I think, is this program of re-enchantment, of bringing magic back into a world that through first the Enlightenment and then through the Industrial Revolution was rendered very prosaic and very unmagical. And one of the programs of paganism is to bring some of that magic back in. And that is done by drawing on a romanticized or an idealized idea of a past where the world was enchanted. Well, the first Christians in Britain, they still believed in elves and fairies. If you look in some of the Anglo-Saxon herbals, they are full of charms against elf shot. They contain spells that invoke the name of Woden. The world did not change overnight, and people carried on doing pre-Christian things without any idea that they were preserving pagan ideas. I think this was just, this is the world and how we do it. And I have a wonderful book in my library, which is a collection of magical spells, Christian magical spells that go back to the 4th and 5th century. And I think this is really quite significant in terms of how much the world didn't change when Christianity first came on the scene. And how much connection there is with the past, and whether the stories that we tell about the past are true or not really doesn't matter. Was there an ancient goddess religion centered on Diana? There are some clues in the witchcraft trials that are suggestive of that. Did the ancient Druids continue in some sort of unbroken line down into the Middle Ages? There are some suggestions that it's possible. But ultimately, it doesn't matter, because modern pagans tell stories about those things. And this is where we come to what I think is a really important factor, and it's this connection with stories. And I think it's very unfortunate, the position we've got ourselves into in the 21st century in Western culture with regard to stories. We think about stories as something that children do. And whilst we all quite happily watch films and watch the television, very few adults, outside paganism, I say, will actively go to a storytelling. And I think that is so tragic, because stories are so fundamental to who we are as human beings. And I think they're also fundamental to who we are as pagans. Another problem we have with the word story is that we've also managed to associate it with something that isn't true. Children tell stories to get themselves out of trouble. In Terry Pratchett's book, one of the, I think it's The Science of the Discworld, which I also strongly recommend, human beings are referred to as pans narens, the storytelling ape. And what is distinctive about human beings above any other animal is their ability to tell stories. And these stories are one of the ways in which we embody and encapsulate truth. And I think that truth about identity and about who we are and about what is important to us is reimagined in stories time and time again. And I think that is really, really quite central to who we are as pagans. One of the things when I was in the very fortunate position a couple of years ago of being able to do a set of lectures for undergraduates at Durham on paganism. There were 4 lectures in total. One was on the history of paganism, one was on paganism and anthropology, one was on paganism and death, because that's what I do. And one of them was on the cultural background to paganism, and the number of people I know who found their way into paganism through fiction of some sort or another. For my generation, it was Robin of Sherwood, and that was certainly true for me. For the next generation, there was The Craft, there was Charmed, there was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. All of these are routes through which people found their way into a genuine pagan tradition. And that's fine, because this is, I think, I've heard some people suggest, well, this is all made up, isn't it? All of these people, their background is in books and films and fiction. They're just making it up. And I think that there is a problem in this word, just made up. And I want to go back and reference what Richard Levy said in the last talk about the imagination and the role of the imagination. I think he said as a point of intersection between this reality and whatever, however you understand that, between this reality and the divine, the other world, the magical realm, however you conceive it, that the imagination is the thing that allows us to connect with that and to interpret it using the flesh and blood brain that we have. And if that has always been through fiction, and if that has been through the popular culture of the last 50 years, has had a huge role in that regard. And the storytelling in there has been a way through which truths have been expressed. And those truths have brought people into paganism, and the continued tradition of storytelling within paganism, within all paganism. Within Druidry, the stories of the Mabinogi tend to be very central, but not exclusively. And there's a quotation, this again came from my researches into what Druidry specifically is. This was something that a friend of mine, Mark Rocher, said about Druidry. I have his permission to use it, which is just as well because I use it a lot. This to me is an absolutely perfect definition of Druidry. And it says, the evolving traditions of Druidry, from ancient and largely unknowable practice through romantic reinvention, have grown through peaceful protest and animist awareness to the partly religious, partly philosophical, partly activist modern Druidry of today. We are the result of 1,000 stories. And here we are now, being us. And to me, that is just such a perfect quotation, because it has the inspirational roots in the past, but it acknowledges everything that has happened since that past. And it acknowledges also the role in storytelling. To a huge extent, we are the stories that we tell about ourselves. And the stories that we tell about ourselves are hugely important in terms of establishing our identity, our values, and how we see ourselves in relation to the rest of the world. And in speaking of the rest of the world, another family quality of the pagan religions is a belief in the natural world as being intrinsically sacred or divine, either personified as a goddess in her own right, or seen as something that is aware through ideas of animism. Animism, I should have mentioned earlier, animism is also an incredibly important belief within paganism, and becoming more so, particularly through the writings of Graham Harvey, who is associated with something called the New Animism. But as he is very keen to point out, there is nothing new about this animism. Animism was originally defined back in the 19th century by Edward Tylor, an anthropologist, as the belief, the primitive belief, that certain rocks, certain trees, certain rivers have spirits. And this was how he then saw and interpreted the primitive religion that he studied. Unfortunately, what he was doing was he was actually imposing a Christian worldview on it, which has been the problem with a lot of the study of religion, because in Christianity you have this division between the body and the soul as an absolute basic fundamental starting point. And so this is what he imposed on what he saw around him. He assumed that this was how everybody else must think. And Graham Harvey, who also studies indigenous religion, suggests that he had misunderstood because of the glasses he was looking at it through, and that it is not so much the belief that everything has a spirit as the belief that, not even belief is such a complicated word, don't start me on belief, I'll be here all night, that that people are trying to live in harmony with other people, and that those people are not necessarily human. And that what animism actually is an acknowledgement of the absolute relationality of life, that you cannot be yourself other than in relationship, and that the things you are in relationship with might be other human beings, they might be animals, they might be plants, they might be ancestors, they might be gods, but you are absolutely enmeshed in relationship with them, and that this is the fundamental idea of animism. And once that became started to gain some sort of academic traction, a surprising number of pagans started to say, oh yeah, that's actually me. And so the number of pagans that identify as animism understood in this new way is another movement that is quite clearly being seen at the moment. But Harvey is very clear, this is not a new way of being animist, this is the old way of being animist, this is what the indigenous tribes have always been doing, but it wasn't understood correctly by the earlier anthropologists. So the idea that the land is something that is worthy of respect, worship, veneration, that leads on to very often the practice of ecology and ecological activism as being a sacred practice in and of itself. Now, this one is controversial and it divides pagans. There are some that will say, this is my spirituality, it has nothing to do with politics. And there are others who will say, this is my spirituality, how can it have nothing to do with politics? It's a good way of starting a row. But I think most pagans, I'm not going to say all, I'm not falling into that trap, most pagans would at least acknowledge the natural world as having some sort of sacred quality. And for a lot of pagans, that links into a need to protect it in some way or another, be that through activism or through ritual or whatever. Another common feature is the idea of ancestors and the importance of ancestors. Again, not every pagan tradition, but it's an idea that is very common. And it's an idea that has also been misunderstood, I think, and has been interpreted in a way that can lead to a certain exclusivism. These are my ancestors, I am in this bloodline, so this is my religious tradition. And it's not yours, so it's not yours. And that, I think, is a fundamental misunderstanding of what ancestors actually mean to the majority of pagans. And yes, it can refer to blood ancestors. And people go to great lengths sometimes to research their own family tree so that they have some connection with their own immediate ancestors. Now, for some pagans, this produces a degree of problem this is quite problematic, because for pretty much all of us, our more immediate ancestors are Christian. And to some, this can lead to a feeling of disconnect, a problem. But as I think I've already explained, my personal take in it is that that Christian tradition is a part of what has happened over the last few years that has led us, the last few thousand years, that has led us to where we are now. So blood ancestors, yes, a lot of pagans maintain some sort of ancestral altar. I did an online survey asking about beliefs about death, dying, funerals, afterlife. Now this is quite funny, because every PhD thesis I've ever read that uses a survey of some sort has a paragraph or two in the methodology chapter explaining why the fact that only 6 people did their survey does not mean it's not a meaningful survey. So I went into this with not greatly high hopes. And I posted the survey in a number of online forums, and friends of mine in those forums took it and posted it in other online forums, and off it went around the internet. And then I got an email from the Wild Hunt asking me to do an article on it with them. And my partner said to me, how many do you need to be useful? And I said, well, if I get 50, that will give me some sort of statistical reliability. If I get 100, that's fantastic. Well, I have 1,060, which I think makes it the biggest resource on paganism and death in the world. And I now have the opposite problem of trying to do something with all of this information. But one of the questions, that's another thing, familial thing about pagan religions, pagans like to talk. That's great. So one of the questions was about the part that ancestors played in people's lives and magical lives, and whether the ancestors took some role in their religious practice. And this survey was answered by all types of pagans, not just Druids, and from all across Europe and America. And 82% said, yes, the ancestors were important to some extent. So I feel fairly confident in saying that veneration of ancestors is a fairly universal pagan thing. Now, blood ancestors, yes. Also, ancestors of place, the ancestors that have been where you are now. And that, of course, is also not limited to humans. So that includes the animals, both current and extinct, that have been where you physically are. It possibly includes, for some, the spirits and the gods of that particular place, whether it's your original place or not. And I've heard people talk about this going back to before the earth existed. So that's another way of thinking about ancestors, people that have walked the same land that you're walking, that have looked at the same hills, at the same landscape features as you. And then, of course, there are the ancestors of tradition. So the people who have made you who you are. And they may well be religious ancestors. They may be the Gerald Gardners, the Ross Nichols, the Doreen Valientes, the great dead that have shaped the tradition that you follow. It could be anybody whose beliefs or teachings or actions have shaped the way that you are. So for me, that includes certain philosophers, it includes certain poets, as well as anybody within the Druidic tradition, and also certain academics that have shaped the way I approach the study of religion. Another common factor in pagan religions is belief in some sort of other reality. So some sort of other world or different reality that can be accessed through trance, through drumming, through mediumship, through ritual, that it is possible to meet and connect with a different type of being. Again, this is not universal within paganism, but it is something that you find in most traditions to some extent or another. understood in very different ways. Another linking factor is ritual. Now, ritual is something that I could give a whole talk on in itself. And I'm going to largely leave this because I think quite a lot of my next talk is going to look at the importance and the purpose of ritual in paganism. But most forms of paganism have some sort of ritual or magic practice. And there again tend to be certain familial connections. So in British Druidry, for example, there is a lot of connection with public Wiccan and witch traditions in terms of practicing in a circle, in terms of calling the quarters, in terms of the importance of the elements. You know, a druid could attend an open Wiccan ritual and have a pretty good idea what was going on, and likewise a Wiccan could attend a druid ritual and have a pretty good idea what was going on. So there are practices that are held in common as well as practices that are quite specific. So in Druidry specifically, there is the association of the quarters with different animals, and there are things such as the Druid prayer. So in America, Druid practice looks quite different, and I think shares more familial concepts with heathen practice in the UK. But again, there is the idea of marking out sacred space in some way or another, of setting an intention, of addressing very often certain beings or entities, and in attempting to, in some way, affect the outside world or affect the inner world of the person that is doing the ritual. So, we're getting towards the end, you'll be pleased to hear. Tiny bit of Pagan 101 for those here that are not pagans. So the main pagan traditions in the UK, and I am focusing on the UK, and I am very aware that the situation, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, is quite radically different from this, and the way that paganism is perceived, both politically and in day-to-day life, is quite different. So I'm focusing on the UK. So probably the biggest, I'm going to say this and I'll probably regret it, probably the biggest single pagan tradition in Britain is Wicca, which, at least in its current form, goes back to Gerald Gardner in the 1950s. And it was certainly he who shaped it as a religion with the help of various members of his coven, and famously Doreen Valiente. It was he who made it look like a religion, if that is a reasonable way of putting it. And it has become a hugely word. I know that Ronald Hutton is very fond of saying that it is the one religion that the UK gave to the world. And I think by and large that is probably true, although I'm going to argue for Druidry as well. After Wicca, probably the biggest tradition after that is Druidry. And I'm going to argue for that being a religion that the UK gave to the world as well, because regardless of what did or didn't happen in the ancient past, and Britain was associated by Caesar with being sort of a place where Druids went to train. But even if he's wrong about that, and Druidry was widely spread across Europe, Druidry as it exists today had its beginnings with, I think, the likes of Iolo Morganwg, and latterly with the likes of Ross Nichols, and it has grown from there. The distinctive features of Druidry, and people will be thinking of white robes and Stonehenge, and that's fine. Doesn't quite look like that nowadays, usually. But the distinctive features, again, there is a concern with ancestry, there is a concern with relationality with the land, there is a particular concern, I think, with the bardic arts and with music and storytelling as being central spiritual practices. There's a number of Druid orders in the UK and in America, of course, where Druidry has a different history and is slightly different. But in the UK, there are a number of orders. The biggest is OBOD, the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. There's the British Druid Order, there's the Anglesey Druid Order, and of course there are a lot of solitary practitioners. Traditional witchcraft, which is different to Wicca, is also a big tradition in the UK. And traditional witches tend to draw on histories that are to do with herbcraft and nature lore and family tradition and psychic ability around that. Heathenry, which is connected with the northern tradition, with the Viking or Saxon gods, to put it very simply. More Viking than Saxon, but I suspect that's because we know so little about the Saxon gods in Britain. They were only here for a matter of about 100 years before the conversion. So they've left very little trace. Whereas, of course, by the time the Vikings got here, it was a lot more literate. There were monks to write about it, and we just know a lot more about it. And that tradition tends to be very closely associated with hard polytheism and with a slightly different type of ritual. And that has seen, I think, a big increase over the last 20 years or so. There are also smaller traditions practiced within the UK. So there are Kemetic pagans who take their inspiration from ancient Egypt, Sumerian pagans, Hellenic pagans who draw from Greek and Roman traditions, and many, many, many others. And also, and I think these people often miss out on getting mentioned, there are solitary pagans. There are pagans that don't belong to a particular tradition, that don't necessarily have a religious community within paganism, but are just drawn to these familial ideas in one way or another. And there is a brilliant book just out by Helen, I'll come back to this, about solitary paganism. So that is a whistle-stop tour of paganism in the UK. Now, before I finish, I do just want to say a little bit about this word religion, because this is one of my personal bugbears. I know that there are a lot of pagans who have a problem with the word religion. And usually this is because they associate it with organized religion, with dogmatism. Very often they associate it with Christianity and this idea of something that is very restrictive. And also they tend to associate it with belief. You must believe this to be this religion. Well, again, don't get me started on belief, because that'll be all night. Belief is not, I think, fundamentally what religion is about. It's what post-Enlightenment Protestantism is about, and it has therefore been what Western anthropologists have assumed that religion is about. But it's really generally not. It's not something that crosses many people's minds. And I don't think it's central to paganism either. Again, taking my example from Druidry, which is what I'm familiar with, you can be in a circle with 20 Druids, and you will not find two amongst them who have the same opinion about deity or afterlife or what spirits are or whether spirits are. And sometimes they don't even agree with themselves one day to the next. And the really key idea there is that really does not matter. There is no expectation that everybody will share the same beliefs. What they share is, and I'm stealing a phrase here to some extent from Philip Shellcrass, is a way of orientating themselves with regard to the world. And particular beliefs within that don't matter all that much. And I think a lot of the pagan angst over the word religion comes from the way that religion has traditionally been defined. And again, we go back to Tyler, has a lot to answer for, does Tyler, and his attempt at defining religion, which was basically the belief in supernatural beings. And there are plenty of pagans who do not believe in supernatural beings. And And it's actually a really problematic way of trying to define religion. It falls flat on its face if you go anywhere near Buddhism for a start. And I think it's because of some of these things that a lot of pagans prefer to refer to themselves as spiritual rather than religious. Now, this is a purely personal thing, and I don't for a moment expect everybody to agree with me. I have a real problem with the word spiritual, because to me, firstly, it feels wishy-washy. What does spiritual actually mean? It's no easier to define than religion. People tend to associate it with personal choice and personal freedom in a way that they don't associate religion. And the other problem for me is the word spirit. It assumes belief in spirits of some sort. Now, this is something I struggle with, which is neither here nor there. But it must surely be possible to be a pagan without belief in spirits. And I know it is, because I know plenty of pagans that do. And to me, this term spiritual is restrictive in that way. And so I personally do prefer to talk about paganisms as religions, but with a slight proviso, which I'll come to in a second. And the way I'm using religion is very different to the way that people have traditionally used religion. And I think this is why I have no problem with the term, and a lot of pagans do, is because we're actually using the word very differently. And this is a fundamental problem with religious studies. There are all sorts of words that are fairly central to religious studies, like God and soul, that there is absolutely no agreement whatsoever about what they mean. And that can make it very difficult to have a conversation where you are actually communicating. Now, there are two scholars I want to mention particularly. There are plenty of others out there, but there are two scholars in particular who are trying to redefine what religion means, and in a way that I think would be much more helpful and much more accommodating of paganism. The first is Douglas Ezzy, an Australian scholar, and I would highly recommend his book, which is Sex, Death and Witchcraft, which is a lot less exciting than it sounds. But in that book, he says that religion is a set of ritual practices that engage symbolic resources to provide etiquette for relationships and an emotional and cognitive sense of self-worth and purpose. So that's not a being phrase, that's a doing phrase, a set of practices. And again, it's about emotional well-being, and it's about a sense of purpose in the world. And Graham Harvey says, religion is a performance, it's an activity, it's something that people do. And again, I think it's unfortunate that that word performance is associated with play acting, and that is not the sense in which he means it at all. We all perform all the time. How we present ourselves to the world is a performance, and how we interact with the world is a performance. And this is how he's talking about it. And he also talks about religion as being effectively an effort to live well in a world which is a community of persons, most of whom are other than human. And that comes down to trying to live ethically as part of a relational mesh of human and other than human beings. Again, it's an active word. That's something that I'll maybe say more about next week when I want to mention pagan ethics a little bit. But there's still a problem with the word religion, because religions are monolithic things. They are bounded. There are boundaries to them. This is a Christian belief and that isn't. And that is just not the way that human beings behave. It just isn't. Reincarnation, for example, is very definitely not a Christian belief. And you would be amazed how many Christians believe it. Because human beings they just don't act in the ways that they're supposed to necessarily. And most of us, most of the time, and this has become incredibly apparent to me dealing with narratives of bereaved people and what people experience at sacred sites and what people experience at funerals, is that all of us, most of the time, hold sets of beliefs that are completely contradictory. And that's fine, because that's how we're supposed to work. In psychology, it's called cognitive dissonance, and it is kind of the normal thing that people do. And for that reason, I am going to suggest that rather than a set of religious traditions, rather than religions, rather than paganisms being a set of religions, pagans are religioning. And this is a suggestion that the religious scholar Mallory Nye made in a paper in 2002, where he said that what people do is religioning. And again, it comes back to this set of practices rather than beliefs. And the idea that, again, relationality, the ability to belong to more than one religious tradition at a time, which a lot of pagans do. There are plenty of Wiccan Druids out there, without holding any internal contradiction. And how pagans go about this religioning is what I want to come back to in the second part of the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. That's been most enlightening. Thank you very much indeed. Can I ask, does anybody have any questions? I haven't seen any questions appear in the chat, but
None at this point. I thought it was very interesting. Thank you.
thank you, Mark.
Do you recognise this?
Jennifer.
Oh,
Mark's. I might be able to highlight him.
yeah, I'll just do that now.
Yeah.
Can you take it back from the camera a little bit? Can't quite see it well enough, sorry.
It's Lampeter College crest.
Oh, right. Yes, I do. Yes.
Yeah, I saw you got some association with it, but no, very interesting.
Yes, that's where I did my master's. Yeah.
Was that online, or did you actually spend time there?
It was distance learning, but I did a number of residential courses.
Oh, good.
I was there usually for a week at a time, twice or three times a year for a number of years, and let's just say it was life changing. It was definitely life changing.
Yeah, any time in Lampeter is life changing. and if you spend time in Conti, even more so. Anyway, irrelevant, but yeah. Good. Thank you very much. Enjoyed that.
Yes.
I look forward to part 2.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that next 2 is next week, same time, same place, I think.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you all very much indeed for attending tonight. I've certainly found it quite fascinating, and I see from a couple of comments there that people are commenting that they were enthralled, really enjoyed the talk. So well done, Jennifer. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay. Shall we close it then?
I think that's an excellent idea.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
How do you do the thumbs up? All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
I'll stop the recording now. All right. See you next week.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.